My name is Vajrapriya, and I have the honor of introducing the theme for the year. We have a theme for the year. This is part of Akash Raja's vision for how Sangha Nights can relate to the sequence during the year of festivals that we have. So we've got 5 festivals through each year. And the idea for this year is that there'll be an overarching theme, and that theme will always be pointing towards the next festival day. So the next festival day is February the 19th, Parinirvana Day, marking the death of the Buddha, or the death of the Buddha's body, and his passing into this very mysterious something called Parinirvana, the supreme nirvana without remainder. So I'll come back to that a little bit, but that's what we're pointing towards in this phase of Sangha Nights. But yes, we have this overarching theme of the noble quest. The noble quest. This is what the whole year is going to be framed within. And the noble quest refers to a particular sutta, a particular Buddhist discourse, which is called the Noble Quest or the Noble Search. And so that's what I'm going to outline briefly this evening. It's a moderately long discourse, and it's found in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length sayings, number 26, if you're interested in looking it up. It's a interesting sutta for quite a few reasons, which I hope to unpack a little bit. So the story begins in Savatthi, which is where the Buddha spent a lot of his time. He had some very important followers and friends in Savatthi, and a nice big pad, a nice big space for retreating in that was given to him by Anathapindika. Anyway, the story is set there, and there's the usual kind of introduction where he's with Ananda, and Ananda's been approached. Ananda is his main sidekick, his helper, if you like, his attendant. So Ananda was an intermediary between the Buddha's followers and the Buddha himself, and he did lots of practical stuff, like sorting out his seat and his water and his food and stuff. But he also had this very important role in mediating between people's requests of the Buddha and the Buddha himself, because everyone wanted a bit of the Buddha. So anyway, some monks said, well, we haven't heard much from the Buddha lately. They said this to Ananda. It'd be nice to see the Buddha. And so Ananda said to them, I'll tell you what, you come along to such and such a place tonight, the hermitage of Ramaka the Brahmin. You come along there and we'll see what we can do. And then Ananda is meeting up with the Buddha, and they do their usual kind of morning routine. And then Ananda says, Lord, the hermitage of Ramaka the Brahmin isn't far away. It'd be good if you went there. out of compassion. So he's kind of setting up this meeting for the evening. And so the Buddha promptly takes the hint, and they turn up. And when they turn up, sure enough, there's all these monks waiting for them. And the Buddha says, "Oh, what were you talking about just now?" This is a little bit of a theme. This crops up quite often, and the Buddha comes across a bunch of either his monks or any other kind of sort of holy folk having a chat. He says, "What were you just talking about?" And sometimes they quickly change the subject and say, never mind what we're talking about, you give us a discourse. And sometimes they fess up to having been talking about all sorts of idle chatter. And on this occasion, they say, well, actually, funny you should ask, we were talking about you. And on this, the Buddha promptly dives into a little fireside chat about his life story, which is rather sweet. So the rest of the sutta is basically a very pithy version of the Buddha's life story. But the way that he dives in is kind of interesting. He plunges straight into this distinction between the noble and the ignoble quest, or the noble and the ignoble search. He says, monks, there are these two types of quest, these two types of search, the ignoble search and the noble search. And he tells them the difference between them. I'll come back to that. I won't tell you what he told them, but I'll come back to that. So it says there's these two different types of search. And back in the day, I was following the ignoble search. I was just wandering around with this kind of mundane life. So he was referring to his life before he kind of woke up to the possibility of something a bit different. And that sort of waking up is usually given in terms of the four sights. You might have come across the story of the four sights, where the Siddhartha sees the sick person, the ill person, and the dead person, and then a monk. And that is the story goes, that's what sets him on the noble quest. That doesn't appear in this sutta at all. In fact, it doesn't appear in any suttas. That's a bit of a later addition that appears in later stories, not in the Pali Canon. It sort of feels as if they needed a bit of a dramatization of what happened more internally. And in fact, the noble quest, this sutta, is interesting for what it doesn't include as much as what it does include. So yeah, it doesn't include the four sights. He just says that I decided to follow the noble quest, the noble search. He just decided to do it. He decides to seek the unborn, the unexcelled, rest from the yoke, unbinding. So there's this slightly strange terminology, unexcelled, rest from the yoke. Anuttara yoga kema. Anuttara yoga kema. Anuttara means unexcelled. Yoga means, yoke or binding. And kema means peace or rest. So he just decided to search for that which would release him from being bound, completely released. That's what he was looking for. So again, I'll come back to that kind of language in a bit. And he says, and so I left home as a black-haired youth. He decided to go forth. He decided to leave home. I'll just read that bit out to you. So at a later time, while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessings of youth in the first stage of life, and while my parents, unwilling, were crying with tears streaming down their faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, put on the ochre robe, and went forth from the home life into homelessness. No mention of wife and child, incidentally. And he was in the first stage of his life, which places him a bit earlier than a lot of the tradition of sort of around about 28 or something like that. First stage of life probably puts him in sort of late teens, early 20s, I'm guessing. Anyway, so that's him gone. Oof, no talk about the dramatic midnight flight on the back of his horse with his attendant. He just goes. So having gone forth, what does he do? He seeks out a teacher, and he comes across a teacher called Alara Kalama, his first teacher. And he he just says, friend Kalama, I want to practice in this Dhamma and discipline. I want to practice your teaching. And Alara Kalama takes him on. And the Buddha says, it was not long before I quickly learned that Dhamma, that teaching. He could see exactly what Alara Kalama had taught. It sounds like it's a bit more than meditation. We often think of his first teacher just teaching meditation, but it sounds like there was a whole doctrine that went with it. He said, as far as mere lip reciting and repetition, I could speak the words of knowledge, the words of the elders, and I could affirm that I knew and saw. But he kind of knew that wasn't the end of it. And he quizzed Alara Kalama. He said, so what's actually the end point of this? What have you actually realized? Through your direct knowledge. And Alara Kalama tells him. And it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough for the Buddha. The Buddha realized that wasn't the end goal. And even though Alara Kalama offered to share his tradition with him, offered the Buddha, Siddhartha, to be his co-teacher, Siddhartha, as in the man who became the Buddha later, he says, no, I'm off. He was looking for more. So he found another teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta. Same thing again. He actually quizzes him quite carefully, sort of, what are you teaching? And again, he sort of matches his teaching, gets to the meditative attainments that Uddaka Ramaputta is teaching, and decides that's not enough. It's quite a long passage, this. I'm sort of skimming through it quite quickly. And again, he was offered the opportunity to lead the community, but he says, no, I'm off. He was dissatisfied with the attainment offered by Uddaka Ramaputta, which is the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, sometimes called the ninth dhyana. So he could sort of see that it wasn't the end goal. He could see that it was a temporary attainment. He could sort of enter into this attainment and then he come out of it. And that wasn't what Siddhartha was looking for. So then he just sort of breezily says, he comes across this town called Uruvela. And he says, I saw some delightful countryside with an inspiring forest grove, a clear flowing river, with fine, delightful banks, and villages for alms going on all sides. And I thought, that looks nice. Why don't I sit down there? It looks just right for exertion. And so he sat down and he said, I reached the agingless, illnessless, deathless, sorrowless, unexcelled rest from the yoke, unbinding. Knowledge and vision arose in me, unprovoked is my release. This is the last birth, there is no further becoming. Bosh, simple as that. So there's none of the no mention of the ascetic period of, entering into all those very severe asceticisms and almost killing himself. No mention of Mara's attack. He just kind of sat down, bish bash bosh, and that was it. So then we go through the next episode, which you might be familiar with, the episode where he wonders, can I actually teach this? It would be awfully difficult and wearisome to teach people who are just attached and grasping. And then the figure of Brahma Sambhati, this high god in that Indic tradition, this sort of God with a small g, he sort of appears and says, oh, go on, except in verse. And the Buddha says, oh, all right then, except in verse. I'm sure we'll get some of these stories woven into later talks. I'm just trying to give you the overall arc here. And yes, the person who is now the Buddha has this vision of this lake of lotuses, some of them still in the mud and some of them rising out of the mud and some of them peeping through into daylight, and realizing that there are people with little dust in their eyes who could receive the teaching. So we're on fairly familiar ground, I hope. So then he decides, or he thinks to himself, who can I teach? Okay, if I'm going to do this, who would be the best people to teach? And he thinks of his past 2 teachers, realizes that they've died, and then thinks of his 5 ascetic friends. So he did go through the period of asceticism. He just didn't mention it before. Thinks of his 5 friends and says, I'll go and teach them. And so he walks off. Takes a few weeks to get there. It's traditionally, it's 2 lunar cycles between the time that he gains awakening and the time that he first teaches. A fair bit of that is spent around the Bodhi tree, but it takes a while to walk from Bodh Gaya to Varanasi. And then we have the scene where he tries to teach, tries to get these 5 friends to listen to him, and they say, nah, you've gone soft. And he says, listen to me, I have achieved the deathless. And they think, oh, he does look a bit different, doesn't he? So they sit down and they listen. And there's this lovely little drama where they sort of form the first Buddhist spiritual community where he's teaching. And they take in turns to go off and beg for alms in the local town. So it doesn't actually tell you what he taught them. He just says they got it too. They also attained the unexcelled freedom from the yoke. So we're almost at the end of this story. He gives them a little teaching. He gives them a teaching about sense desire. And as long as we're infatuated with sense desire, with sensuality, we're like a wild deer that's bound up by snares. And if we aren't tied, if we aren't caught up with sense desire, then we're like a wild deer who can roam at will, living in a wilderness glen. Carefree it walks, carefree it stands, carefree it sits, carefree it lies down, because it's gone beyond the hunter's range. And likewise, if we break free in the way that he's talking about, a monk is said to have blinded Mara. Trackless, he has destroyed Mara's vision. Mara is the kind of the Buddhist baddie. We having crossed over into this state of being unattached to the world, carefree one walks, carefree one stands, carefree one sits, carefree one lies down, because we have gone beyond Mara's range. So that's how he ends the story. So within that story, we've got basically we're set up for a whole year of festivals. So leading up to Parinirvana Day, we're going to be focusing specifically on the whole idea of the noble quest. What really gives our life meaning in the face of death is the noble quest. And then after that, we've got Buddha Day, the festival of the Buddha's awakening. So we'll be dwelling on that phase of the story leading up to the Buddha's awakening, Siddhartha's awakening. And then after that, we've got the phase leading up to the Buddha's first teaching, in which we can look at some of his significant teachings. And then we've got the phase leading up to Sangha Day, when we can talk about the formation of the Sangha. So we've got quite a year ahead of us. We can draw lots out from that. And as I say, frame it within this sutta on the Noble Quest. So what I want to do for a little while is give some more attention to the Noble Quest itself. This is going to be the first phase, the Noble Quest and the Ignoble Quest. What does that mean? So the sutta is called the Ariyapariyesana Sutta. Ariyapariyesana Sutta. Arya, you might have come across. This means noble. It's the same word that we get in the Noble Truths, the Four Noble Truths. That's translated noble. And pariyesana is sometimes translated as quest, or search, or inquiry. So, is this challenging language? I hope this is challenging language. Do you feel yourself to be on a noble quest? Do you feel yourself to be on an ignoble quest? Let's find out what the difference is. So, the Buddha tells us, he says there are these two types of quest, two types of search. The ignoble search, the ignoble quest, is where a person, being subject to birth, seeks happiness in what is likewise subject to birth. Being subject to aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement, one seeks happiness in what is likewise subject to aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement. So what may be said to be subject to birth? Well, here we go. Here's a nice list for you. Spouses and children, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowls and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, mares, gold and silver. Those are all subject to those things. So we probably have to do a little bit of translation, assuming you don't have any mares or male or female slaves or such like. You might well have spouses and children, though. So basically all of these, all of the objects of our attachment, everything that we could get attached to, are subject to birth and death. In other words, they have a beginning and they have an ending. Whatever it is we've acquired, we're going to lose. And if we seek happiness in things, if we as a being who is conditioned, who's been born and who's going to die, if we seek happiness in other things which have the same nature, have the same conditioned nature, then that is the ignoble quest. So what is the noble quest? This is the case where a person, themselves being subject to birth, seeing the drawbacks of birth, seeks the unborn, unexcelled rest from the yoke, unbinding, anuttara yoga kema. Themselves being subject to aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement, seeing the drawback of aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement, seeks the agingless, illnessless, deathless, sorrowless, undefiled, unexcelled rest from the yoke, unbinding. Okay, so this is challenging. What does it mean to seek the agingless, illnessless, deathless, sorrowless, undefiled, unexcelled rest, blah, 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 all that stuff. The unborn, the deathless, these are other words that the Buddha uses. What does it mean to seek the unborn and the deathless? So one could spend a long time pondering this. I think the simple way of translating this is nirvana. We probably know the word nirvana or nibbana, enlightenment, awakening. And another word that's often used is the unconditioned. So in a nutshell, the ignoble quest is seeking happiness, seeking fulfillment in the conditioned, basically in everything that we know, in everything that we can see, touch, taste, feel. If we seek ultimate satisfaction in our senses, in our sense experience, that's not going to end well. So we are given this carrot that there is something beyond. There's something beyond all this. There's, as it were, a state that the Buddha called awakening, or the unborn, or the deathless. That there is a something, an unconditioned. There is something transcendental. And now, of course, this is very difficult to talk about, isn't it? Especially because probably we haven't experienced it. I think the use of talking in this way is that it makes it very clear to us that this isn't a state of being psychologically sorted, having kind of smoothed out everyday dukkha and become, basically pretty happy and content. There is something else beyond that, completely beyond that. I was on a seminar. I was very lucky to be on a seminar with Sangha many years ago. And we were talking about this, about the conditioned and the unconditioned. And I think in the group we were in, we were sort of trying to, as it were, make the unconditioned understandable. We were trying to relate to it. And he said, there's a discontinuity. The conditioned can never reach the unconditioned, but it does. Thank you, Bhante. And we were talking about the language of the unconditioned. And we're saying, unconditioned, that just means it's, in other words, it's not conditioned by greed, hatred, delusion, doesn't it? That's what it means. It means in the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion, that's the unconditioned. I can understand that, sort of. And he said, well, you can talk about it like that, but it's also talked about as a realm, as a dhatu, as something that exists as a realm. So he was very keen not to let us land on a sense of something that we could understand. It's like something, as it were, beyond our ken. This is what he was going on about. He says, it seems that both views are necessary. Nirvana is an object to be known, as it were, and a state that can be approached. These are my notes of what he said, anyway. So, where does this leave us with the noble quest? It's like the noble quest contains an element of mystery about it, that we can't actually know what it is that we are moving towards. But we know that it is what do we know that it is? Well, we know what it isn't. We know that it's not getting caught up with the superficial appearances of this world. So let's turn it into slightly more understandable language, shall we? Hopefully. We have the language of false refuges and true refuges. We saluted the shrine, we saluted the three jewels. Those are our true refuges. The false refuges are when we get caught up in spouses, children, men and women, slaves, goats, pigs, sheep, gold, silver, motorbikes. I'm looking at someone. One could probably go around the room and pick on people. I'm sorry to be unfair, Marcus. Pick your poison. It's when we get caught up in the more sort of superficial entities of this world. the sort of everyday particularities of life, when we get immersed in, I don't know, speaking for myself, YouTube and all the various stuff that appears there, and just relating to the things we have to do, our everyday things that we have to do, just in order to survive and earn a living and pay the bills and so on. Just relating to them in a way that is puts too much weight on them. It's like paying the bills is important, but it's not what life's about, is it really? Nor's YouTube and all the rest of it. So one of the things we're going to be doing in the next few weeks is looking at true and false refuges. So the false refuges are those things that we tend to pay too much attention to, tend to put too much weight on. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to be hearing from Vajrapriya, who's going to talk about them. Sorry, she's talking next week. Next week, she's talking about them. And then in 3 weeks' time, we've got Lee and Darren who are going to have a chat about them together. In between, in a couple of weeks, an episode I skipped over very slightly. If you remember when the Buddha came along and saw all those monks chatting away, and he said, "What were you talking about?" And they said, "We were talking about you." He said, in fact, I'll tell you what he says. He said, I've lost it. He said, "Good monks, it is fitting that you, as sons of good families who have gone forth out of faith from home to the homeless life, should gather for Dharma discussion. When you have gathered, you have two duties, either Dharma discussion or noble silence." There's a bit of a high bar, isn't it? When we meet in the Buddhist Center, we either talk about the Dharma, about the Buddha's teaching, or we keep quiet. There we go. And Akash Raj is going to interpret this for us in 2 weeks' time. He'll tell us what we can and can't talk about in the Buddhist Center.
Put up on this.
There's a list of 26 things in the suttas which you can't talk about, by the way. A long list starting with kings, so we can't talk about the new king, and such like. Anyway, so I'm just giving you a little bit of a sense where we're going now. So we've got a couple of weeks talking about false refuges. We've got a week talking about Dharma discussion. We'll have a practice evening on the 1st of February. And then we've got a week on the noble quest, on the true refuges. So what actually constitutes a life of a noble quest? Samantha Badri will be unpacking that for us. And then we're getting close to Parinirvana Day at this point. And the interesting thing about Parinirvana Day is it's reminding us about death. It's reminding us about the brevity of life and how, well, the difference between a finite life and an infinite life is very interesting. It's a bit like the difference between a photo and this. It's like when you have a photo, you frame something limited, and that frame gives that limited thing a kind of particular meaning. And I think it's like that with life. Having a finite life gives what we have particular kind of import and weight. And so it means we have to, well, it's important what we do in it. And so that raises the whole question of using our time well and a sense of urgency. And this is what Vajradev is going to talk about just before Parinirvana Day, spiritual urgency. So that's more or less what I want to talk about.